Alright guys, welcome to the video. So we're still working on the walnut tea cabinet here. In the last one, we got everything glued up, our shelves fitted into the inside of the case, and everything is looking pretty good. So between the videos here, I went through and put a second layer of finish, or a second coating of finish on the inside of the cabinet, and did 2 layers of finish on all these shelves here. And so everything is still a little bit oily because I just put the second coat of finish on. And so the reason this is going to work out really well in our favor is because when we actually install these shelves, we want to make sure that glue isn't sticking to the whole length of the sides of these here. Because basically this panel on the cabinet here is going to try and grow and expand as it's hanging on the shelf. And if we glue this whole shelf into that spot, it's eventually just going to rip that panel apart because it's not going to allow the panel to grow and expand naturally because it's trapped by these pieces. So having a little bit of oil just on the ends of these shelves is not a problem because these shelves are going to be pretty much purely held in by our back panel, which we're going to be making in this video. And so I've got this piece of quartersawn fur that I'm going to be using for the back panel. If you watch my Instagram stories, you'll know that I bought a big chunk of this stuff for pretty much no good reason, just because I wanted to see what it looked like. And I found out that it is crazy expensive. And so because this is an 8/4 piece, it's very thick and chunky, we're going to be taking it down to 1/4 inch thick strips. And then we're going to be doing shiplap along the back panel to give us a nice look. Okay, so we've got our panels mostly cut to size. I was way off on that 4 1/4 inch. It worked well for our middle panel, so our middle panel is still at 4 1/4 inch width, but our two outer our two outer pieces are now just under, I think, so we're just about a 16th under 4 inches on our outer panels. And so what I decided to do, as soon as I cut it, I knew that it wasn't actually going to work out very well because it was just obviously the proportions were going to be way too far off. So because I knew that I want to have a 1/2 inch on the shiplap portion of this, I just marked that on this piece of wood here. So we got a 1/2 inch in from either edge, and then I could just work down the two side pieces until I could line that up nice and evenly. So we're lined up evenly now. So now all I have to do is cut a 1/2 inch rabbet. Yes, technically speaking, it's a rabbet down the one side of the outside boards, and then the inside or the one side of this board. Okay, and so we're not going to be doing this in the traditional shiplap method. I think normally for something like this, to do actual shiplap, you have a minimum of 5 pieces. That way you just have you have more overlapping points. But because our pieces are fairly wide, what I'm going to do is I'm going to make it so that the middle panel here is the furthest back, and then our other two panels are going to appear full width on the inside of the cabinet, and then this one will be cut in narrower. So we're going to cut the rabbets on the middle piece on what's going to be the inside face, and on the inside face, and then we're going to cut the rabbets on the outer two pieces on what's going to be the back side of the outside face. So I know that's really confusing and it doesn't make a lot of sense. It doesn't make a lot of sense to me either, but it will work. And so what that'll do is it'll give us more proportion inside the cabinet. And so to cut the rabbets on those pieces, we're going to be using a dado stack. Now, as you can tell, this dado stack is fairly new looking, and that's because I've literally used it once before, just to make sure that it could set up and works fine on my table saw. So this is a 42 tooth dado stack, which means it's got 42 teeth on both the outside blades, and it's got a nice selection of, I think they're 4-tooth chippers, which are just the pieces on the inside. And now the reason I'm using a dado stack and not like a rabbeting bit on my router is because I don't have a nice rabbeting bit. The one that I have is really, well, both the ones I have are really old and heavily used. It's probably time for me to get a new one, but I just don't like it nearly as much as doing it on the table saw here. So the other thing, because I have a saw stop, is I have to use the special brake cartridge, which is the extra wide ones meant for a dado stack. And so when you're setting up a data stack, you always want to start by putting your leftmost side in. And you can tell your leftmost side is because it'll usually have the points on the outside, which makes it a little bit easier. And then from there, you always need to check your chart that your dado stack will usually come with. So for here, I want to do 17/30 seconds because I know that's going to be perfect for what I need. So I know I need to have the 2 outer blades, a 1/8 inch chipper, a 1/16 inch chipper, and a 3/32 inch chipper. And so the most important thing with a dado stack is all your teeth don't need to be perfectly aligned, but you have to make certain that they're not touching. You know, nothing's overlapping with each other. So it's usually best to just go and do a quick spin around and check. The Philonic insert that I have here is the one I used last night when I first set up the blade. I've got a 1/4 inch cut in there from when I was using it as a 1/4 inch dado stack. Now that we're doing a 1/2 inch, we're just going to throw this piece of wood over top of the insert here, just so that way it can't get kicked back at us when we are cutting through it. All right, so we've got our back panel all finished. It's in place, as you can see here. I also apologize for the last clips that I recorded here. I totally forgot to turn on my extra light to actually light up my face here. I don't know why I forgot about that, but I was just leaning back at some of the footage and it looked really dark. So I do apologize for that. I've got the light now, we're all good. So anyway, you can see the back panel here went together beautifully. We've got nice tight seams all the way in there. One thing I will note, if you have the contractor saw, the saw stop contractor saw, or pretty much any 1 3/4 horsepower table saw, you probably don't want to go much more than a 1/2 inch dado stack. Now, it will depend on your saw. If it's the actual cabinet saw, it might be different. But I had pretty good vibrations. You know, some of the stuff on like the back end of my table saw here was rattling around a bit. So I probably won't do much more than a 1/2 inch dado stack in this saw. But I'm glad I have a nice quality, like the dado stack that I have can go up to 23-30 seconds. So that's pretty big. But I probably won't ever do that with this saw. I'll probably wait till someday when I have a higher horsepower saw, because horsepower really is what matters when you're trying to run a dado stack. But anyway, it worked perfectly for my application here, and for all the projects I'm planning in the future, I just know that I can stick to that 1/2 inch dado stack. I could probably go a little bit wider, but I'm probably never going to go up to like 3/4, because that would probably be just far too much for the motor of my saw to try and handle. So right now we've got pretty much perfectly seamless on the back, perfectly seamless on the inside. Everything looks seamless, which is great. That means it's all built properly. That means all our surfaces are referencing each other really well. But now we want to create some gaps, because the problem with the way it is right now is it's just a glorified panel. I mean, literally we could glue it up and it would just be a panel, but we don't want to do that. We want to make sure that each one of these pieces has their own ability to move. And so the way we're going to do that is just, if I pop it out here, and so all I'm going to do is just using my low angle jack, I'm just going to slowly walk back the edges. And not on this one, all in our middle piece here. Because all I care about is creating a small gap on the inside, on the visible thing. Okay, so I've got all our pieces in, everything's looking good, our gaps are nicely set up. I decided I'm not actually gonna go and put a chamfer in, just because I don't think it's gonna look, I don't think it's gonna improve the look any more than it looks good right now. And that was a very hard way of saying that, but it looks good right now the way it is, with just a very small gap. And so the way it doesn't really work the way it is right now, because our pieces are a little bit bowed, just because they're so thin and they're resawn from 8/4 material. They are just not really cooperating with me. But as soon as I get them pinned down, it won't be any issue. But anyway, yeah. So we've got our pieces in, and we've just got a very small gap. I think it's maybe a 32nd of an inch, if not a little bit smaller, and it's just enough to to be there, really. And so I do have the pieces in backwards right now. This is going to be what you see on the inside, because I'm doing it that way so that I can actually see it without having to pick up and manhandle the case around. And so when I actually put this thing together, I have to make sure that I check that gap and all that, make sure I align everything properly before I start hammering things in. Speaking of hammering, that's how we're going to be attaching this back panel. Generally, when you're attaching back panels, you want to either nail them in or screw them in. You generally don't want to glue in a back panel. All right, so to nail these in, we're actually going to be using just brad nails. So these are 3/4 inch brad nails. I forgot the size there for a second. And so because we're only going through 1/4 inch material, we don't need very long brad nails. This is probably even a little bit overkill. You could probably go with 1/2 inch. There's 2 ways you can put these in. The way we're gonna do it and the proper way. The proper way is to use a brad nailer or air gun. I have one, but it's not accurate at all. Sometimes it'll shoot the nails all weird and off center. I have to get a good one at some point, but until then, I'm just gonna put these in one at a time the old-fashioned way with a hammer. And so I've got this nail punch here that will work to actually help drive these things in. It has a slightly concave end, so it'll hold the nail head in. We're gonna get a little circle on the fur, but that's not a big deal. Again, it's on the back side, you're never really gonna notice it. And we're gonna be covering it up, all the nail holes anyway, with our French cleat and our bottom piece. And so really quickly, before we actually put these in, I just put a fresh coat of oil over them, just because I can. It doesn't really do anything different, doesn't really affect anything. It just makes it a little bit easier to get that first coat on. Because that first coat has to go on fairly thick and heavy, it's a lot easier to really, lap that on right now, and it can sit there and cure for as long as it needs to in the case. It doesn't really affect anything because we're not using glue. It doesn't affect anything at all. Okay, so the next part of this is going to be mounting the French cleat. So the first thing we have to do is actually make the French cleat. And so I just have this offcut of walnut. It's literally just a piece that I have laying around from other projects that I have going on. And it's going to be a perfect thickness. So all we have to do is mill it down till we're I would say, just a hair over the thickness of the case. And so one thing I will mention is that normally I wouldn't be making this French cleat out of walnut because walnut is kind of an expensive wood, kind of a nice wood that you want to save for more useful things. This is just an extra piece I have laying around. It's probably too thin to really use for anything else, but it is literally the perfect thickness with a little bit of milling will be the perfect thickness for our French cleat here. So just in case you guys think I'm crazy for using walnut for a French cleat, normally I wouldn't do it. Normally I'd use, a secondary wood like ash or cherry, something that's cheap. But again, I have this sitting around. I don't want to mix another wood into here, so I might as well just use some walnut. Okay, so we've now got the French cleat cut and our bottom spacer piece. So our bottom spacer piece is a fairly loose fit. So we're about a 1/16 loose on this, which means it's got a little bit of room to move back and forth, which is exactly what I wanted. Just because that way, again, if this piece grows, expands, whatever, it's going to be fine. Also, this piece is really just not meant to be anything structural, so it can be a little bit loose down there and it doesn't affect anything. Our French cleat on the top, because it's such a thin piece, I actually wanted to keep it fairly tight in there. And so the way we're going to be installing this French cleat is 2 parts. We're going to be putting it in with screws and a little bit of glue. So right along the top of this piece here, where it connects to the long grain of our top panel, we're going to be gluing this to it. That way it just adds a little bit of extra support along with the screws we're going to be putting into it. And then for the actual part that goes onto the wall, the wall mounted part of the French cleat, what I did is I took about 1/4 of an inch off this over the length of it. And so you can see here how it actually has quite a bit of playroom. And what the reason you do this is because you don't want to have to try and line up the cabinet perfectly on this piece like the top piece is, because trying to get the cabinet onto the wall and perfectly lined up onto this piece, you're gonna scratch up your walls. You're gonna bang up the cabinet you're gonna bang the cabinet on the walls. It's just generally bad practice. So by taking off about 1/4 of an inch and having a little bit of that play in there, it's much easier to actually get the cabinet onto the French cleat, and then you can kind of you have a little bit of play in it, so you can kind of adjust it either 1/8 of an inch or 1/4 inch either way to get it aligned exactly where you want. So you want to be really careful when you're clamping on the French cleat because you don't want to damage that edge. You can go in and round it over if you were really afraid of damaging it or it gouging into the wall or something. But I find that that's a little bit easier to do when it's actually all together, just because that has a little bit more rigidity to it. And so to hold the French cleat on, I'm going to be using number 6 by 1 inch screws. The reason I need to go 1 inch is because my French cleat is 3/8 of an inch. My back panel is 1/4 of an inch. That takes us to 5/8. Then we actually want to sink this screw into the body of the case, which is then needs to be that extra 3/8 of an inch. So we're going to be sinking nice and deep into the actual case, which will give this thing a lot of strength and support to it. And so this is a nice size because it works well with just the way that we've made everything else here. Our rabbet is only 3/8 of an inch deep from into the sidewall. And so we want to make sure that we're staying within that. And so what I've done here to make this really easy on myself is I've gone through and I've set this combination square to the depth of my walls of my case. So, and then I just put simple little marking lines on both sides, and I just put a hole right in the middle of that square that I created there. And so then I know when I'm drilling down and where I'm putting the screw is going to be perfectly in the sidewalls of this case. We're gonna add a pretty good sized chamfer. Again, referencing our screw, we know we need a decently large. And so the most important thing to remember anytime you're putting screws into hardwood and you're at this stage of a project where you're right at the end and you don't want to mess things up, anytime you want to make sure that you don't have headphones in or anything like that, and you want to listen for any creaking or cracking. Now, when I put this screw in, we had a little bit of creaking and cracking as we started going through, but then that sound slowly dissipates. And anytime you hear that little bit of creaking or cracking starting, all you want to do is go forward just a turn and then come back out of the way. And so the cabinet now is pretty much finished. All we have left to do is to do the actual finishing part, which is going to be cleaning up our protruding dovetails a little bit, cleaning up our sides a little bit, and just overall finishing the rest of the outside of the cabinet here. So I think it looks pretty good. This quartersawn fur, definitely once you get some oil on it, it looks really, really good with that nice, straight, clean grain. It is quite a bright orange color, but I do think that works very well with the darkness of the walnut. You can see in there, if I get the right lighting on it, how well it actually brightens up the inside of the case. It brings a little bit more life and light into the inside of the case without being as bright as something like maple or ash would be. So in the next video, we're going to actually be working on finishing the outside of this case and putting the tray together that is going to be going on this section of the shelf. Those are going to be two fairly short topics, and we're going to be covering them in that one video. Then the video after that, the last one of this little series here, is going to be making the drawers that are going to go at the bottom here. So that one's going to be really interesting because we're going to be doing half-blind dovetails and, well, a combination of half-blind dovetails and through dovetails in the back of the drawer. So make sure you guys subscribe to see that one. And yeah, so I do hope you guys enjoyed this video, and I will see you in the next one.